welcome to all those joining on the line. We'll give it just one more minute.
Hi, Priscilla.
Hi, good morning, Ian.
Dr. Cassano, how are you? My apologies for a second late. I was on the IC town hall until 10 seconds ago.
No apologies. We're perfectly on time.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you very much for joining us. Incredibly important topic.
It's my pleasure. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, maybe with that, we are 1 minute going on 2 minutes past the hour. I know we have lots to talk about today. Ian, would you like to introduce Dr. Cassano to the rest of the Grand Rounds group and we could get started?
I would indeed, Priscilla. It's an
Wonderful.
incredible pleasure to do so. Can I start by saying that in many previous fora, we've discussed the importance of mental health and its role in disability-adjusted life years suffered across the globe. And recently, we've had a number of presentations and looked at what is the burden of disease that the developing and developed nations actually suffer. And mental health is a huge and growing part of that. So with that said, I think it is incredible privilege and exciting to have Dr. Paolo Cassano join us today for BSc Grand Rounds to present on this topic, paradigm shift in external stimulation solutions for depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, with the example we're focusing on today of photobiomodulation. Again, non-invasive external stimulation strategies seem like a wonderful way for us to be treating or providing an adjunct to medical therapy or pharmacotherapy for these disorders. Now, Dr. Cassano is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and director of the photobiomodulation group at Massachusetts General Hospital within the Depression and Clinical Research Program. And he's the principal investigator at MGH Centre for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Disorders. Now, he received his MD and PhD in clinical neuropsychopharmacology at the University of Pisa, and then pursued postdoctoral studies in mood and anxiety disorders at the MGH Depression and Clinical Research Program, and then graduated from the MGH McLean Adult Psychiatry Residency Program in 2009 at Harvard University. Since then, Dr. Cassano has led multiple studies on transcranial photobiomodulation with near-infrared light for the treatment of anxiety and mood disorders. And he's also conducted translational studies aimed at discovering the mechanisms for action of photobiomodulation. His translational studies have focused on the effects of near-infrared light on mitochondria, cerebral blood flow, brain electrical activity, and of course, on a topic dear to my heart, the autonomic nervous system. For his studies on photobiomodulation, he has been awarded competitive national grants such as the Brain and Behaviour Research Foundation NARSAD grant. Now, of course, when you're treating depression, anxiety, and these other debilitating conditions and doing it with a non-invasive, non-pharmacological strategy, you receive considerable attention from the media, and he has indeed received that attention from news and conventional media outlets as well. He's co-authored more than 50 publications, and he's an associated editor of photobiomodulation, photomedicine, and laser surgery. In 2016, under Dr. Cassano's leadership, the MGH Psychiatry Photobiomodulation Clinic was started, and he is pursuing transcranial photobiomodulation as a treatment in psychiatry. Dr. Cassano, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, and I'm totally excited to hear this presentation. I think many others on this Grand Rounds today will be equally excited to have your presentation, so please take it away.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. It is my absolute pleasure to be here today as a speaker. I will say as an initial disclosure that my presentation is anything but scientific. I will actually barely touch base on depression, anxiety, and PTSD. This is not a review of the literature. However, it is inspired by my work as a clinician, as a clinical researcher, and also as an inventor and as an entrepreneur. So talking about that, being an entrepreneur, I do have some disclosures. I co-founded a company in the space of light-based therapy and external stimulation. However, none of the products of this company are presented during this talk today. So Tom Brady was, when he started his career in the NFL, was the 199th pick to be drafted. He was drafted as the 6th round. And as a matter of fact, he didn't drill fast enough. His body appeared quite flimsy. His spiral was not tight. So you wonder, what did the coaches, the trainers, and the expert miss? Why this happened? So what they missed was his ability to handle stress, his ability to handle stress under time pressure, his ability to rally his team, his fast decision making while in action. And similarly, technology that defies our model of care, technology that appears unsuitable to our healthcare system, has the potential for the greatest disruption. One of my patients is about to redeployed. She's a woman with depression and with PTSD. Most likely she'll be deployed in Afghanistan. You could say that she's a hero. She's a hero for how she served our country. She's a hero for how she's handled her weaknesses, especially being a combat person. Now, when you think about external stim, the current in-office external stim, how does that fit the need of our forces? Maybe our forces abroad in foreign soil. So, and how does it fit the needs of our forces in the United States? Those are the people that are highest risk for depression, for PTSD, and unfortunately for suicide as well. So it's obvious that we need something that is more flexible, something that is portable, something else. Now, what about all of us? We are definitely under much stress. And this year has been a year of challenge where we confronted many challenges. And there's been a huge impact in mental health due to the pandemic. So here are the data from the CDC clearly depict how the anxiety symptoms, the prevalence of the symptoms have at least tripled. And so the depressive symptoms have also been increasing much, and altogether depression and anxiety have quadrupled. So it is a year of challenge. And the question is, again, how is external stim for depression and anxiety meeting the needs in the population at large? But even before the pandemic, when you looked at, here's the example of depression and the treatment of depression. If you look at the upper quarter here on the left side, where you see all these colors, you can definitely see a vast proportion of people that responded to antidepressant medication. Then there is a proportion in green of people that are either non-responding or projected not to respond to antidepressants. And then those who don't respond to somatic treatments and antidepressants. Now, if you think about external stim, the in-office classic external stim has really pointed to this group of patients that are not responding to antidepressants. And maybe some of those who didn't respond or are not projected to respond to some other external stimulation. But what about all the rest? We're talking about 3/4 of patients with depression. And the same, I can assure you, is for anxiety or PTSD that are not treated, because these people are actually not accepting or are declining the current standards of care. And of course, some of them will receive psychotherapy, counseling, but it's also true that access is hard. Accessibility is an issue, especially when you think about evidence-based treatment for anxiety or for depression, even more so for PTSD. So definitely there is a challenge. There is an enormous need. And how's external STEAM fitting in here? So in this cartoon, you see two scientists. They know what are the premises. They know the beginning. So what's the need, the area of need? They might know where a kind of a solution might lie and what it might look like. However, right in the middle, there's this question of how do we get there? Then a miracle occurs, and it is really a question mark. And then one scientist tells the other, well, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. And so my promise to you is to be more specific today and to tell you what's the vision here for external STEAM. What are the steps that are taken? What do we need? Obviously, we need to fulfill the expectation and meet the need in the population. And I think we do so by going through a real paradigm shift. And I would say that this paradigm shift are 5. So the first one is wearable. So there are already many wearable devices that are external stimulation devices. And those are a reality. For instance, transcranial alternating current stimulation, or TACS. Or there is also cranial electrotherapy stimulation, CES. There is transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS, and also now external vagus nervous stimulation. So there are treatments that are potentially usable at home. They're wearable. They're different from the current standard of TMS or ECT, the current external STEAM, which are bound to be in office. And all what we need is a treatment that is safe enough and that is effective enough that it would make sense to be applied and extended to those millions of people that are actually need and that are not currently receiving treatment, that are not willing to take a medication. So what's stopping us? So let me tell you this. We've done this before. So I guess the point here is that we've been there, we've done that. And in the 80s, up to the 80s, when you think about the treatment for depression and for anxiety, we were using medication, antidepressant medications that were lethal in overdose, that were requiring sometimes special diets, that were requiring EKG monitoring every so often to make sure that we were not at risk of causing arrhythmias. And all of a sudden, the happiness pill came about. It was exactly what I'm describing here. Something that was effective enough and something that was tolerated well enough. And so Lilly came with this medication, the first SSRI, Prozac. That opened the door for primary care to prescribe vastly medications that now have been prescribed to millions of people, antidepressant for anxiety, for depression. And so the same way it happened then, it can happen now if we have a wearable device. So here, this brings me to one person that is dear to me. She's my aunt. She's one of many that suffers from depression. And she suffered from depression for many years. She also suffers from another condition that is called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. You could say so she has a broken heart. And the challenge of this condition is that you can only prescribe so much of antidepressants because you risk to decompensate and trigger cardiac heart failure, congestive heart failure. So in that situation, she declined ECT. She did not have access to TMS. Finally, she accepted to take wearable at-home devices for external stimulation for her depression. That was, per her account and per her family, a dramatic change. She still has ups and downs in her mood, but that was an incredible change, and it gives me the chills to talk about. She agreed to this disclosure today. So the next point here that I want to make is another shift. The second shift is digital power. It's unquestionable. There is enormous power in digital data. During one of these pandemic nights, weekend nights, I was browsing over the Netflix. I guess that was a Freudian sleep, the bruising here, because this is kind of a hard to watch documentary called Social Dilemma. It talks about the enormous power of social platforms and those digital data. I was there sitting and kind of staring at the video. Then I called my wife. We both sat in our couch under our blanket, and we couldn't stop staring at this C-level ex-employees of this giants that were talking about their fears about the use of social data. And the point here is that there's enormous predictive value in the digital data. The example is about social digital data, but it's true for any type of data. And there's the prediction of who we are, what we like, and what we might act upon. And that's enormous power. Power that can be used in healthcare. Now, when you think about those data, and here again, I'm depicting the growth of data in terms of social digital data, but it's the same for the data that comes from the different wearables that you use or from your cell phone, from different apps. What is striking is that in the past 10 years, there's been an enormous growth, which if you compare to the previous 10 years, it's clearly exponential. And that's how the data are growing. It's not just about the availability of this data. The truth is that the various giants in the space of the digital world and our digital society are preparing platforms like the Apple Health Kit or the Samsung Health Kit or the Google Health Kit that are the very purpose of this platform is to integrate this data and make it available and inform people. So if you have an external STEAM device that is controlled by an app, that is ideally suited to basically leverage those data. And platforms are created for those data to be channeled. And so there is an opportunity to monitor and to guide the treatment here. And there's great help that can come from it in our next generation of external stimulation. So now the next paradigm shift is what I call closed loop, and it's our third paradigm. Now, let me tell you that leveraging data, whether it's physiological data or actual brain data from the neurophysiology, it's nothing new. We've done that in office. So in the lower right picture here, it's the biofeedback. On the upper left, it's the neurofeedback. So in the biofeedback, you can trace heart rate variability, heart rate. You can trace skin conductance. You can trace temperature. In the neurofeedback, you can trace, for instance, brain electrical activity, e.g., brain oscillation. And I personally actually did play with biofeedback. And let me tell you that it's not easy to make sense of this data. And seeing it tracing and also understanding how to change your responses, because that's the goal, learning new behavioral approaches, new relaxation techniques, and see how those change the tracing that you have in front of you. That requires active effort from the provider, from the user, besides being an in-office intervention. And the challenge of large data and making sense of large data is very familiar also to us as clinicians in tertiary care and dealing with electronic medical record. It's hard to access data sometimes. The question is accessing meaningful data that will have an impact on the care that you deliver. Summarizing the data, again, to have a meaningful impact, as I said. And this is a well-known challenge that we're facing in our society, in healthcare. And if you go in PubMed, there are already publications that talk about the workflow issue. How do you put that in? How do you factor the new data in the system, in the decision-making, when the provider is facing those decisions with a patient? And if that were not enough, those platforms, electronic medical record, are already set up to integrate all the wearable information that comes in from the different wearables that the patients are using. So that's a challenge, and of course, a great opportunity as well. So how do we respond to that? Well, on one end, if we have a machine, a device that is wearable, an external stimulation device, and then we have sensor. In this example, sensors that are specific to the neurophysiology, to the brain activity. You could imagine that in one hand, the machine is actually writing on brain function, is actually modulating or neuromodulating brain function. But also, the sensor is providing information over that modulation. And then you can detect here in blue before the treatment, the signal, and after the treatment or during the treatment, the signal. And you can detect the delta, the change. You can also argue that you can consider different thresholds that you might think about as therapeutic for that intervention. That in itself is the closed loop. So what you will notice here is that there is no interface. There's no interface from the user or from the provider. This is a machine-driven process, which actually has the speed of the machine. And we know that when it comes to processing of information, managing and handling large data, machines, machine learning, AI are the way to go. Now, that can lead to personalization of dose then. That's the big opportunity that wearable devices, personalized, data-driven, and closed-loop based devices have. And you can imagine validation that is based on other sensors, other digital data, that peripheral data, and possibly validation that is based on the person also telling us how they feel, maybe on an app. I would say also that you could think about the digital data from, yes, from local sensors, sensor that register directly from brain activity, but you could think that those thresholds of what is an effect, a measurable effect, could be derived also from peripheral data that are related to our overall function. Let's say, did the patient with depression or anxiety achieved or returned to the baseline of the 10,000 steps per day? That could also be informative. Now, the next paradigm shift, the fourth paradigm shift, is the real time. This is Rome. This is where my aunt lives. As I mentioned before, she still experiences ups and downs and frequently adjusts or frequently needs adjustments of her treatment for depression. Now, this is nothing unusual. That's very common, even as a psychiatrist. I constantly chasing wellness, chasing the symptoms that my patients present from time to time when they come to my clinical appointments. And now she has a psychopharmacologist in Rome, but I'm the expert in photobiomodulation. That's the device she's using so which is basically modulation of brain function through the use of near-infrared light, transcranial near-infrared light. And it's not easy. It's not easy at a distance to do that. So the bottom line is that we are ever changing, that our mood changes all the time, symptoms change all the time, and we need treatments that are changing in real time. And if you are thinking at an in-office device for neurostim or in-office device or a medication, an antidepressant, those are treatments that change if there is input from the provider. That's a big limitation. We need treatments that are closed loop, that can change moment to moment, day to day. The way we have personalized treatments so far has been often by looking at a snapshot. We think about genotyping. We think about, okay, what's your pharmacokinetic? What is the pharmacodynamic for your body? So now the terms, what are the enzymes that are going to metabolize a certain medication, or what are the profile of receptors that you have? And it's a one snapshot. But how is that going to be reflected over time? We have the experience as providers that even when prescribed the same medication over time, people don't do necessarily as well all the time. Sometimes they develop more side effects, sometimes they lose the response, they regain it based on life stressors, based on seasonal changes. So how do we personalize in real time? And I would argue that a new generation of wearable with closed loop can also be real time. And this is particularly critical when you think about emergencies like craving for substances or for alcohol. And or maybe suicidal ideation, urges. So then it's important to have a treatment that compares whatever data that you have, digital data, at this moment to the historical data that you had, that you collected for a year for this patient, and say, well, it so happened that you were on this pattern. And that's called digital phenotyping, defining someone through their digital data is as potentially as powerful as genotyping or as a clinical definition, which is based on symptoms. And then you can digitally phenotype that person at that moment and compare to how they felt, how they were digitally a year ago, when maybe they had the same crisis, and maybe when some specific parameters were really effective in reversing that crisis. So that can be based on historical digital data, but it also can be a comparison with population-based digital-based data. And therefore, you have an option of personalizing based on digital. Now, this seems probably far-fetched, and you might think this is science fiction. However, I'm going to tell you it's not. This is happening already in inpatient, or mostly, I should say, in office therapies, which are also device-based therapies, but in office. And so the team of Dr. Camprodon here at MGH in the Division of Neuropsychiatry looks at TMS and how to personalize TMS. And what they do, and I should say we do because I'm part of the team as well, we look at functional MRI, we looked at functional connectivity, DTI. So basically, in simple words, we look at functional tests. We see areas that light up in the imaging, and that allows us to precisely map a certain area with a functional specificity, and then target that area exactly, specifically. Now, the mapping of different areas is different on different brains. And also, we can also look at connectivity of different circuitry and look at how different brain areas are connected or any deficiency in connectivity. And we can isolate then some nodes of those connections that are superficial enough that they can be targeted by TMS. So now we have a specific circuitry that we're targeting based on a deficiency that is specific to that patient and condition. So the question is, how do we export that? How do we make it happen? It happens already for in-office TMS, for in-office external STEAM. How do we make it happen for the wearable external STEAM? Now, the other paradigm shift I want to talk about is evolution. So we're kind of aware these days of how evolution happens in the software space. And then I would argue that when you look at software space evolution, you could see that nearly, and this is the case of Windows, I'm sure you're familiar with, that nearly yearly there are changes. And those changes are across the different dimension of this software and the applications. And as you go in the timeline, you can see that even more of these dimensions are involved. So those changes are extremely fast. So these changes happen at a software level, not a hardware level. So when we look at the TMS, we didn't have to change the device to make it more personalized. It was just computational. It was data-driven, a software algorithm. That's the speed of evolution of the new wearable external steam personalized closed-loop devices that are real-time. They can also evolve at a speed that is unparalleled in the system, in the panorama of the neurotherapeutics. And when you compare it to the speed of evolution for a new medication, this is the speed for bringing a new molecule to the market. It's more than a decade from drug discovery to preclinical to clinical to regulatory. It takes an enormous time to get a new molecule. So we can argue that there's a drastic change in speed if we embrace wearable external steam. And one of the challenges of the current system, if you think about, pharma is still the main go-to, the predominant treatment for depression, for anxiety, and still for PTSD. However, that medication, it's a one size, and we know that it doesn't fit all. So what happens in practice? In practice, people like me, providers and neuropsychopharmacologists, they will just juggle with polypharmacy to try to kind of create a cocktail of medication that is more kind of fitting in and really responding, hopefully, to the needs of the patient. But that, of course, the more medication you put in, the more side effects you get. There are challenges like adherence. So this treatment take a long time to develop, and they are not really personalized. So in summary, until now, I told you about wearable as being easy to use, affordable, scalable, safe and effective enough. That's the goal. And also powered by digital data, the enormous power of digital data to personalize. And then closed loop, where there's this effortless personalization at play in the real time, that the personalization is not just for the individual, but for the individual that day, day to day, moment to moment. And as if this was not already enough, then the prospect of evolution of this new generation of treatments. Now, I promise you an example, and we're nearly at the conclusion of my talk. However, the example I want to bring is the example of photobiomodulation. I think these changes are inevitable and stoppable. It's going to be a disruption in how we see treatment, certainly how we see external stim for anxiety and depression. But I do owe you a little bit of science, I think, today. So our group has looked at how external steam through near-infrared light transcranial can modulate EEG signal. And here we see that after treatment, the red line, there's a clear enhancement of EEG signal. And this actually is in healthy subjects even. We also found that if we change the dose, we actually lost the signal, lost the difference. We were not able to write into the brain function if we decrease the dose by 1/3. So definitely external steam, wearable external steam can modulate brain function, as is in the example of photobiomodulation. So again, to this familiar picture, right in, this is, you see here, the example of the light that is being shed on this modeling on the frontal lobe, the actual modulation of brain function, the sensors, which here can be very simple and available already in the market, even as a consumer product these days, dry electrodes for EEG recording. Then there is the potential then for reading. And here you have the schematics of the EEG function or EEG recording. Again, as I mentioned before, the possibility of using that EEG signal for a threshold that can be individualized and personalized based also on other available data that indicates that there's been an achievement, that the benefit has been achieved. So just a few remarks now about the regulatory space. You might think that in the future, then there will be this type of devices that will be approved for external stim, for depression, PTSD, and anxiety. But also there might be algorithms, there might be computational algorithms that could be approved and that could work across different type of external stim devices, where they're based on light-based external stim or electrical external stim or other forms of neuromodulation. And those algorithms could be based on, again, the modality of neurostimulation, but also the chosen digital data, the indication for use, and or a combination of all of those. And you could think that also as new data is available, let's say you're putting in voice as opposed to GPS, or as opposed to what's your speed of typing on your mobile device, you could think that new algorithms might come in, and that the impact will be kind of with a different weight of the different sensors and digital data might lead to new predictions and new ways of informing the treatment. So as these are substantially non-significant risk devices by FDA standards, you could also imagine that this will potentially become indicated also for early intervention for asymptomatic states of disease. This is particularly important, as you can imagine, for diseases like Alzheimer's that start happening from a neurobiological point of view decades before they are actually symptomatic. But it's also true for depression, where you might have an episodic well-being, but you might still be at risk of a new episode or a new trauma for PTSD. It's also important to notice here that some simpler versions of these devices, because they are non-significant risk devices, are likely to permeate the consumer market and to be used for wellness. And to that extent, to be non-regulated. People already are looking at these devices for improving their performance, their brain health, aging, and generally speaking, for what is considered brain hacking. So finally, a conclusion here, what I call precision in disruption. So how do we define precision? You are familiar with the Versailles genus DBS. The precision of this device, it's unparalleled. The precision of the topographic identification of the area, the precision of the dose deep in the brain is unparalleled. And quite frankly, it's unlikely that wearable external stim will ever meet that topographic precision. So depending on how we define precision medicine for wearable external stim, we might achieve the next game changer. Now, when you think about digital health, it's a vast area that includes all our wearable, all our data. Obviously, it includes also the digital medicine, the data that our EMR are collecting, that our providers are going to use. And within that, there is digital therapeutics. That's exactly what we are considering now. And that is our next frontier. And as external wearable devices are expanding, that's where the opportunity lies. And it's particularly an opportunity if you consider that the growth of the precision lies on the availability of the data. And the availability of the data, we know it's growing exponentially. So we might infer that the precision will grow exponentially for this digital neurotherapeutics. Tom Brady was the next game changer, and he was a near miss. Thank you.
Dr. Cassano, outstanding presentation, very provocative, beautiful start, beautiful end, and you gave us a lot to actually think about. And as a team, we have a significant interest in non-communicable diseases and the ability that the populations of developing and developed nations are facing. And if you have that approach, you can't ignore the burden of mental health disorders and how a medical device company could play in this space. And of course, as a human, you desire to have something that meets that primum non nocere approach. And so extracranial approaches to supplement traditional psychotherapy and medications seems incredibly appealing. And so I think what you've done today is walked us through some of the important considerations. And I'll certainly open this up to questions. I just would like one question to ask before I open it to everyone. And if because these are non-significant risk interventions, is there a risk of actually muddying the water until we really understand what does and doesn't work? I see the natural appeal of wearable devices and how they might be applied, but will that actually add to the time that it creates to get a true understanding, or would really reduce that window?
So if I understand correctly your question, you wonder if the early adoption by consumers of this device will actually somewhat interfere with the process of science and development of devices that are actual FDA-approved therapeutics. Is that your question?
Yeah, asking whether could it be that will enhance or distract. So I'm not really sure whether that's an advantage. I suspect it is, but I just was asking that in a somewhat provocative way to see how you view the sort of consumer uptake of potential technologies, and whether that will accelerate our understanding or potentially distract us from understanding what the real methods, real values are.
So I have no doubt that it's going to accelerate our understanding. The consumers are ready to use these devices and are ready to share their data. And I can't say that being a professional myself, that we are ready to adopt these devices. And so, and also I would think that if you look at the industry is made of very small companies that are very dedicated, very devoted, that worked on this space for decades sometimes. But the large companies that really have substantial capital to invest are mostly, to my knowledge at least, not really looking at this opportunity. And so in this current scenario, you need people to step up. And so I think consumers bringing in this opportunity to the front line really might move the field forward.
Thanks. Perhaps I could open this up. I mean, a lot was actually covered here, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I see.
Looks like Maren has her hand up. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Dr. Casano, for a fantastic presentation. This was a technology that I was not aware of, and so this was really eye-opening for me. I have about 20 questions, but I'll narrow it down to 2 just to give some other people time to ask. But so my 2 questions are, what do we know about safety and effectiveness of this therapy in children? And second, so I live in Minnesota, which is essentially the equivalent of the Arctic tundra in the continental United States, where seasonal affective disorder is really common. So I'm also wondering whether you think this would be an effective treatment option for things like SAD.
So let me tell you that in MGH, we are actually starting 3 studies. I'm not conducting those studies directly because I'm prohibited by my conflict of interest to conduct those studies or be involved. But those are studies in children suffering from autism spectrum disorder, mood disorders, whether it's bipolar or depression, unipolar depression, and the third in attention deficit disorder. And so we think that there might be great opportunity. As a matter of fact, if you think about depression in children, one of the greatest risks is inducing hypomania or mania while treating with antidepressant medication. And we wonder whether neurostim could be less likely to induce those manic switches. If you think about, for instance, electroconvulsive therapy as an in-office external stimulation, it also has some mood stabilizing effect. So you can use it for mixed states with people who have both mania and depression. So there's definitely interest and potential for children as an intervention and external stim for that purpose. As concerns SAD or seasonal affective disorder, yes, so we have seen that the treatments that work for depression oftentimes work for seasonal affective disorder, and that has been seen for antidepressant medications. So I would assume that based on preliminary data that support the use of external stim for depression or for anxiety, that would be effective also for SAD.
I have a question, if I might jump in. I'm curious. We're thinking about this as a potential for consumer solutions, but there's probably a lot of value for solutions that are perhaps either a prescription from physicians or have the backing of physicians. What do you view as necessary for physicians like yourself to be willing to adopt or support this kind of technology? Is there clinical evidence that's required? Is there education that's required? What do you think is going to build this field in addition to consumer interest?
So there's no question that education is required. The very word medicine, when I think about my training, we're trained to prescribe medication and we're trained to consider surgical procedures. So these were the 2 treatments we were trained for. We're not so much trained to think about outside that box. And And data, large clinical trials, absolutely, and large companies that have experience in that arena can really bring that forward and perfect it. The good news is that it's much easier to get FDA approval for, and you know that, I don't have to tell you, for device-based interventions than for medication, or at least that's my understanding of it. So both are fundamentally important. I would definitely, it is my belief that there is space for consumer devices and there's space for medical grade devices. And my vision is that a physician in the future might say, well, let's try to take out the voice out of the algorithm. I'm not sure that this is the most important thing here. I would like to try this different algorithm to personalize your dose. And or maybe, well, you seem to have melancholic depression. We should definitely have more elements that are informing of your motor function, whether it's the number of steps, your GPS, whether it's your voice, your volume. This is critical for me to monitor and adapt the treatment. So I would want an algorithm that really works this way for you. So different thinking, and also the power of the device might make those devices medical grade as well and require more medical monitoring.
Thank you. Others have questions for Dr. Cassano?
But just to go on from that last point, there's no reason why a therapy like this, and I say therapy, couldn't be both commercial and medical grade. It's a spectrum of how the device was used, and whether you can unlock capabilities that would make it medical grade at one end, but without those features unlocked, perhaps more of a consumer product, or is that too far?
No, you're absolutely. I'm sorry, did I interrupt you?
No, I think you got it. I was just wondering, that it seems to me just because it isn't implanted or it isn't a drug and it didn't require any intervention doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't therapeutic in a clinically meaningful way. So if the same device could provide a spectrum of opportunities, perhaps it's capable to unlock or lock components that might be more onerous in terms of the burden of medical surveillance or oversight. Is that how you view it?
I totally agree. Absolutely, there are devices. It's very much likely that kind of a lower grade device based on intensity of stimulation might be what you would use for aging or for improving performance. And then if you have someone that is really psychomotorically slowed down, you'd have a different intensity and a different grade of personalization as well. And so those features would be what will go through an approval pathway and will be subject to basically the prescription of the provider as well.
We didn't really touch too much on cognitive or pro-cognitive effects today. And I think we're going to have to invite you back at some stage to talk about that field, because I found learning a little about you that is incredibly provocative and interesting as well.
From that standpoint, we are having currently 2 studies, one in Down syndrome, and one in mild cognitive impairment from Alzheimer's disease. So we're definitely exploring that part.
Well, perhaps we've reached the top of the hour, and maybe I could take this opportunity, Dr. Cassano, to say we sincerely thank you for the time you spent with us. It's incredibly provocative, and I think for all of our senior leaders and interested parties on this audience, we all learned something from you today, and it would be a great pleasure to have you back at some stage, because I think within that presentation, there are a number of topics that I think we could expand on, but I love the way you presented it, and we're certainly keen to hear more, and particularly, as we said at the end, on the pro-cognitive and cognitive effects of these types of therapies. So perhaps I could finish by thanking you most sincerely for being part of our Boston Scientific Grounds. You enrich and help us to grow, and for us to think more broadly by seeding these sort of thoughts and concepts for us. So
my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure having you, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you.